Alright, in this standard 3b, we have to explain colonial response to such British actions as the Proclamation of 1763, the Stamp Act, and the intolerable acts as seen in the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. Let's put that in there. Make sure we include these women and daughters of liberty. Alright, so that's our standard, is to explain colonial response to such British actions as the Proclamation of 1763, the Stamp Act, the intolerable acts as seen in the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, and the Committees of Correspondence. Alright, so what are all these things about? What's this Proclamation of 1763, the Stamp Act, the intolerable acts? What are these things, these British actions? Why are they going on? We learned in the last unit that the French and Indian War was a pivotal point in America's relationship with Great Britain, because it led to Great Britain imposing revenue taxes on the colonies right here, and it changed its policies and started making them pay more taxes in order to pay off this war debt, which is accrued or made because of the fight with France and the French and Indian War. Alright, so our standard says we have to learn about those things. If we look at some of the British colonial policies, all those changes are going to make the colonists angry. You know, some people try to equate or try to use an analogy of the colonies as these teenagers, 16, 17 years old, who have been let go for so long and had this habit of self-rule and taking care of themselves that, you know, after this war, Great Britain's going to try to come back in and start putting down strict rules for the colonists to follow. And the analogy is like a dad or a mom that's gone from a kid's life for 16 years, and then they come in when they turn 16 and try to tell them what to do. You know, what they get is a lot of rebellion from someone in that situation. And I see a lot of people trying to make that analogy, but it will help you understand it. But what we want to do is look at these actions. Alright, so if we look at a few of these, the Navigation Acts of 1763, we talked about Navigation Acts, and a lot of those Navigation Acts that were passed under Oliver Cromwell and King Charles II, they were followed, but there was a lot of smuggling going on through there without landing in the British ports. But after 1763, what we're going to see a change in British colonial policies is that they're going to strictly enforce those Navigation Acts. You know, before they were under salutary neglect. Either Great Britain and Parliament, you know, was unwilling to strictly enforce it, or they were so preoccupied with other matters that they couldn't strictly enforce it. But at any rate, in order to protect the British wealth, the Navigation Acts were strictly enforced after 1763, and they saw a need in doing this so that they could get money and get currency to pay off their war debt. That's Great Britain. And one of the first acts was the Sugar Act, and there was a Molasses Act, but the Sugar Act of 1764 is going to anger colonists because it requires taxes on sugar and on molasses and rum that was it would be strictly enforced. And even though the molasses and sugar and the rum was a struggling enterprise already within the colonies, when they start to strictly enforce these taxes, it's really going to hurt this struggling enterprise. So colonists are extremely upset about this. And then down here, let's skip Stamp Act. Writs of Assistance, 1767. The British government had these customs officials living in the colonies, and the customs official needed to search ships or needed to search people's houses and dwellings. So the writs of assistance that were passed in 1767 was where a law that said custom officials could search without cause, just because they wanted to, for any smuggled goods that colonists had in their homes or in their ships or wherever, that those custom officials can go in there without a warrant, without any official document, and that they could search those places. The colonists viewed these as a violations of their liberties, the right to privacy, and so that's going to make them mad there. and that's when we're going to see that later when we start talking about the Bill of Rights. We're going to see one of the amendments says, the fourth one says there can't be illegal searches and seizures. And then the Townshend Acts, we're going to talk about those too a little bit in detail, even though they're not in our particular standard mentioned there. But Parliament places tax on paper, lead, glass, tea, paint, and the colonists are going to boycott these items. In other words, refuse to buy them from Great Britain until the law is repealed. And the law will be repealed, and the Stamp Act will also be repealed because of this boycott strategy that the colonists come up with. And then the Tea Act 1773, the colonists, after the Townshend Act is repealed, Parliament's going to pass this Tea Act, and this is going to anger colonists because, and along with the Stamp Act and all these other acts, any type of tax the colonists were mad at because they thought it was against their rights, constitutional rights or liberties. And they said no taxation without representation. They didn't have any representation in Parliament when these acts were being passed. And then the colonists are going to take this tea and dump it over into Boston Harbor. The Boston Tea Party by the Sons of Liberty is going to anger Great Britain. And then Great Britain's going to respond with the Intolerable Acts. And then eventually we're going to have our Declaration of Independence. So that's what we're talking about here, is how are the colonists going to respond to all these changes in British colonial policy, and how is this conflict between the colonists and Great Britain, how is it going to lead us to declaring our independence and then having a Revolutionary War? So if we look closely, we see that there's two here that are specifically mentioned in our standards if we look back at them, the Stamp Act and the Intolerable Act. So let's look at it. Explain colonial response to such British actions as the Proclamation of 1763, the Stamp Act, and the Intolerable Act. So we see the Intolerable Acts, we see the Stamp Act, and I circled those in red to show you. We're going to look at those in greater detail. And then which one did we leave out? British actions such as the Proclamation of 1763. So we want to go right in here and add the Proclamation of 1763. So these are three big areas that are listed in our standards we need to discuss. So let's look at this first one here, Proclamation of 1763. King George III comes straight out and told the colonists, look, we have all this land east of the Mississippi River now, and there's a lot of Native Americans over here. And he issued this proclamation. King George III, said he outlawed colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. In other words, over here on the western part. And these American colonists are land hungry. They want to go over here and they want to settle this new territory and have open and new territory, then come in and farm past the Appalachian Mountains. So the king says, don't go, don't colonize over here, don't settle this land, don't go into this frontier. And let's look at this line here. This line represents pretty much what the King George III is telling them not to go past. And if we look at this natural line, we see, the Appalachian Mountains going up in here. Okay, so let's look at a relief map. The Appalachian Mountains. See, King George III said, don't go over into the Ohio River Valley area. Don't go past these Appalachian Mountains to try to colonize. There's Native Americans over there, and we don't want any trouble with them because we don't have any money to send troops over here to put down some type of conflict going on between the colonists and the Native Americans. And that was a reason for the proclamation. He knew that a westward expansion of the colonies west of the Appalachian Mountains, that's this way over in here, would cause conflict with Native Americans, and if something broke out, he would have to send his British army over there to take care of it. So he said, we're broke, we're in debt from the French Indian War, we can't afford to have another war. Okay, so that's the Proclamation of 1763. There's the line. We just explained the Proclamation of 1763, but we have to look at our standards. It says explain colonial response to such British actions as the Proclamation of 1763. So what is really important for us to understand here is colonial response to the British actions. So we need to talk about how did the colonists respond to this proclamation of 1763. Real simple. Colonial response was rebellion. In other words, the colonists disobeyed and they went and settled and colonized on the other side, west of the Appalachian Mountains anyway. They're going to go into Tennessee and Kentucky through the Cumberland Gap, and they're going to go over here and settle these areas in rebellion, in a rebellious spirit, in opposition to the king, because they really wanted this land over here and they really wanted to settle it. Okay, so they're going to go anyway. Alright, the next one is the Stamp Act. Let's look at the Stamp Act and what it is. This is 1765 law in which Parliament established the first direct taxation of goods and services within the colonies. And what we had was these raised seals on paper, or these stamps on paper that asked if you had any type of legal documents, newspapers, playing cards even. So lawyers, graduates from colleges, people who published newspapers or pamphlets had to pay for these stamps to be put on their paper. And that's going to cost colonists money. But the colonists are going to protest this act by boycotting all goods coming from Great Britain. And that's how they're going to respond. And you're going to hear them yell, "No taxation without representation." And they're going to have this argument that Great Britain, Parliament, and King George III cannot tax us if we don't have anybody representing the colonies within Parliament. So their response is going to be boycott, and boycott basically means don't buy. And a modern day example would be when British Petroleum, or this gas company here, oil company, had the spill down in the Gulf of Mexico, and a lot of people were upset about that as environmental implications, and so a lot of people refused to buy British Petroleum oil because of that. But anyway, a boycott is a strategy that was used by the colonists to get Great Britain to repeal the Stamp Act. It was effective. Great Britain is going to repeal the Stamp Act, and what the Americans did in the boycott is they refused to buy British goods. And we're going to see this again in our study of history when we talk about the Civil Rights Movement, Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King boycotting in Montgomery, Alabama buses. And we're going to talk about Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Worker Movement, and that group boycotting California table grapes. And we'll look at that later on. But the colonial response to the Stamp Act was they protested and boycotted. The Sons and Daughters of Liberty were formed, and the Sons of Liberty were a protest group formed by Samuel Adams. He was their leader after passing of the Stamp Act, and all of their actions were to resist these restrictions and actions that are coming out by Great Britain. And we're going to talk in a minute about how the Sons of Liberty are going to participate in the Boston Tea Party, throwing the Boston tea over into Boston Harbor. And so they're going to use action and sometimes even violence to protest British encroachments on their liberties. The Daughters of Liberty are going to be helpful in that they are going to sew and weave fabric that was usually bought from Great Britain. They're going to try to help the colonies become self-sufficient and independent of Great Britain, and they're going to be very instrumental in the boycott movement, boycott of British goods. So that's how they react and respond to these actions. Women helping out in sewing and weaving is comparable to resisting British and eventually being in war. So women had a very, very strong involvement in events that are going to lead to our independence. Committees of correspondence. The committees of correspondence in each of the 13 colonies were secret committees or groups that were formed within each colony that secretly communicated with committees from the other colonies. And they did this, and they tried to make a concerted or united effort to react to British actions, or actually to resist British actions. So, and this is going to be the first time that all the colonies are going to unite together in organized resistance against Great Britain. So down here, Sam Adams suggested setting up a committee of correspondence in Boston. Then he got cities and towns and other colonies to do the same. Each committee wrote letters to one another, and these letters, the letter writers would explain what was being done in their colony to protest the British laws. An example of one of these letters was a letter from the Committee of Correspondence of Connecticut to the Committee of Correspondence in Boston in 1774. And here's a copy of it here. Now let's read a little bit of it. It says that this town cannot assume it is a merit that a claim to divest us of our property, liberty, and life, a cruel and arbitrary and unjust by a blow aimed at our head. In other words, Great Britain is trying to injure our rights to property, liberty, and life, roused our attention and zeal, and determined us to unite with our brethren through the continent in a determined opposition. So unite with other colonies in determined opposition to the destructive measures pursuing against us, and a virtuous and manly struggle in every lawful and constitutional way for our liberties and rights, which must never have been given up nor parted with in the course of things. Dangers will threaten, many evils overtake, many hardships be felt. Here they're talking about British actions, and endured by those parts of America that the British ministry, we're talking about customs officials, Parliament, King George III, and that craft and policy, as well as open insult and violence, will be used to force a submission of particular places and provinces, to weaken and disunite us. And here's the part down here at the bottom that's really important. We apprehend it as our duty to oppose a constant adherence to our rights and a union of every part of America against the violence and oppression which may threaten or be inflicted on any part of it, meaning America. So they're joining together, they're uniting in opposition against Great Britain. So how are all three of these, the Sons of Liberty, the Daughters of Liberty, and the Committees of Correspondence, all agree that the most effective way to protest and rebel against Great Britain is to boycott? That is a financial or economic rebellion. In other words, refuse to buy the goods that are coming from Great Britain. And in large part, this boycott is going to be effective. The Stamp Act was repealed. And Parliament's going to pass a declaratory act saying they have a right to tax the colonists, and then directly after they're going to pass this thing called the Townshend Act. And the Townshend Acts were a series of acts that were enacted by Parliament in 1767 that established an indirect taxes on goods imported from Great Britain to the British colonies, and those goods were paper, lead, tea, glass, and paint. And in going with our standards, how did the colonists respond to this? By boycotting those goods, by refusing to buy those goods, and that response is going to be effective, because what's going to happen is Great Britain is going to repeal the Townshend Acts partially. They're going to keep the Tea Act. One of the acts, the Tea Act, and they're going to give a monopoly to the British East India Company. And so Great Britain repeals the Townshend Acts, but gave a monopoly on tea, sold to the colonies to the British East India Company. And even though the tea was cheaper, the colonists are also going to boycott this tea, and the Sons of Liberty are going to dress up and take this in Boston Harbor, take this tea and dump it over into Boston Harbor and protest. So they threw 300 barrels of tea into Boston Harbor. So they've been very rebellious against any type of British actions. Now, British are not going to like this. They're going to get upset, and then they're going to pass a series of laws or acts called the Coercive Acts. Now, the British called them Coercive Acts, but the American colonists called them Intolerable Acts because they could not tolerate these laws. So A series of laws enacted by Parliament in 1774 to punish Massachusetts colonists for the Boston Tea Party. So it's a punitive series of laws because of the Boston Tea Party. Parliament suspended colonial government in Massachusetts, and then the laws in these intolerable acts took away colonists' right to a trial by jury, and then soldiers who went to Boston could search and seize any property or any vessel at any time without a legal document, and this is called the writs of assistance. And colonists were required to house soldiers in their home at any time, even in times of peace. So when those soldiers come to Boston, if you owned a tavern or if you had a house and food, you had to give quarter to the troops without any pay. And we're going to see these in the Bill of Rights to the United States Constitutions later on. In the Bill of Rights, we're going to see amendments that are against the quartering of troops. That's the Third Amendment. And then the fourth is the right to privacy, rights against unreasonable searches and seizures. All right, so what's the colonists' response to this? The colonists are going to call for the First Continental Congress, and every colony is going to show up except Georgia. Georgia does not go to the First Continental Congress, and this First Continental Congress is going to send an olive branch petition and try to send for redress of grievances to the king and have him repeal these intolerable acts, but he doesn't listen. He ignores them, and then they're going to have a Second Continental Congress. By the time they do, there's going to be Lexington, Concord, and Boston. There's going to be skirmish or warfare going on. And then in 1776, the Declaration of Independence is going to be issued by the Second Continental Congress. So let's look at our standard. Explain colonial response to such British actions as the Proclamation of 1763, the Stamp Act, and the Intolerable Acts as seen in Sons of Daughters of Liberty and the Committees of Correspondence. Let's look at these in this chart. Here's the British action, reason for the British action, and then the colonial response. The Proclamation of 1763, King George III says, "Do not colonize west of the Appalachian Mountains." Reason, he wanted to prevent Native American insurrection because Great Britain was in debt and could not afford another war. Colonial response, they go anyway. They cross over the Appalachian Mountains anyway and try to colonize. Stamp Act. Stamps attached to paper documents that must be bought from British officials, and the British passed this in an attempt to get Great Britain to get American colonists to raise funds to pay off the British war debt and to pay for the administration of the colonies, those officials, customs officials, whoever was in the colonies. And that debt was created by the French and Indian War. And the Stamp Act, the response to it is that the Sons of Liberty were founded by Sam Adams, and they're going to do protest and action, and they're going to also boycott. And we see that the Boston Tea Party was carried out by the Sons of Liberty. Daughters of Liberty were women who assisted in the boycott movement by producing goods usually bought from England, sewing and weaving a lot of fabric, shirts, pants, curtains, whatever was needed. And then the Committees of Correspondence are going to unite the colonies in secret opposition to Great Britain and its actions, and they're going to recommend boycott of English goods as well. And then the last one here in our Standards and Tolerable Acts was the suspension of colonial government, the writs of assistance, and the quartering of troops. And these were enacted by Great Britain to punish Boston, Massachusetts because of the Boston Tea Party, and the British called these acts coercive acts. And a colonial response, they saw them as rebellions. The colonial response to the Intolerable Acts is they organized the First Continental Congress to coordinate a protest. They sent an olive branch petition to King George III, but he ignored it. And the hostilities break out between Great Britain and colonies. And war started in April 1775 with Lexington and Concord. And then the Declaration of Independence, typo. Declaration of Independence is going to be signed in the Second Continental Congress. So a good way for us to look at this is look at a timeline of events. So we see the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, and the proclamation of 1763 is given in that same year. And then in 1765 the Stamp Act, and then in 1767 the Townshend Acts, and then both of those will be repealed, and then the Tea Act will be passed in 1773. The Boston Massacre occurred in 1770. In 1774 we have the Intolerable Acts, and then a response to that was the First Continental Congress. And in the First Continental Congress, redress of grievances were sent to the king. And then Lexington Concord was in 1775. And then 1775 Second Continental Congress was established to deal with Great Britain. And then in 1776 the Second Continental Congress declares independence from Great Britain. Okay, did we meet our objective? Explain colonial response to such British actions as the Proclamation of 1763, the Stamp Act, and the Intolerable Acts as seen in the Sons of Liberty and Daughters of Liberty, and the Committees of Correspondence. I believe we met this objective. If you want to look back over these, just look at the video again. I hope this helps. But there was a lot of smuggling going on through there without landing in the British ports. But after 1763, what we're going to see a change in British colonial policies is that they're going to strictly enforce those navigation acts. You know, before they were under salutary neglect, either Great Britain and Parliament, you know, was unwilling to strictly enforce it, or they was so preoccupied with other matters that they couldn't strictly enforce it. But at any rate, in order to protect the British Wealth and Navigation Acts were strictly enforced after 1763, and they saw a need in doing this so that they could get money and get currency to pay off their war debt. That's Great Britain. And one of the first acts was the Sugar Act, and there was a Molasses Act, but the Sugar Act. Alright, in this Standard 3b, we have to explain colonial response to such British actions as the Proclamation of 1763, the Stamp Act, and the Intolerable Acts as seen in the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. Let's put that in there. Make sure we include these women and daughters of liberty. Alright, so that's our standard, is to explain colonial response to such British actions as the Proclamation of 1763, the Stamp Act, the Intolerable Acts as seen in the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, and the Committees of Correspondence. Alright, so what are all these things about? What's this Proclamation of 1763, the Stamp Act, the Intolerable Acts? What are these things, these British actions? Why are they going on? We learned in the last unit that the French and Indian War was a pivotal point in America's relationship with Great Britain, because it led to Great Britain imposing revenue taxes on the colonies right here, and it changed its policies and started making them pay more taxes in order to pay off this war debt, which is accrued or made because of the fight with France and the French and Indian War. Alright, so our standard says we have to learn about those things. If we look at some of the British colonial policies, all those changes are going to make the colonists angry. You know, some people try to equate or try to use an analogy of the colonies as these teenagers, 16, 17 years old, who have been let go for so long and had this for 1764. It's going to anger colonists because it requires taxes on sugar and on molasses and rum that was it would be strictly enforced, and even though the molasses and sugar and the rum was a struggling enterprise already within the colonies, when they start to strictly enforce these taxes, really going to hurt this struggling enterprise. So colonists are extremely upset about this. And then down here, let's skip Stamp Act. Writs of Assistance, 1767. The British government had these customs officials living in the colonies, and the customs official needed to search ships or needed to search people's houses and dwellings. So the writs of assistance that were passed in 1767 was where a law that said cohabitus self-rule and taking care of themselves, that when after this war Great Britain's going to try to come back in and start putting down strict rules for the colonists to follow. And the analogy is like a dad or a mom that's gone from a kid's life for 16 years, and then they come in when they turn 16 and try to tell them what to do. What they get is a lot of rebellion from someone in that situation. And I see a lot of people trying to make that analogy, but it will help you understand it. But what we want to do is look at these actions. Alright, so if we look at a few of these, the Navigation Acts of 1763, we talked about Navigation Acts, and a lot of those Navigation Acts that were passed under Oliver Cromwell and King Charles II, they were followed